Can a quiet forest animal speak to a human without words? Can its silent gaze cry out for help louder than any siren? Yegor Kuzmich Sokolov, who lived in the taiga for 72 years, would always answer, no. The forest lives by its own laws. Cruel, honest. And in these laws, there is no place for pleas. But on that day, when the sky merged with the earth in a blind whirlwind of snow, the old hunter had to question everything he knew. The blizzard howled so loudly that it seemed as if the world itself was cracking at the seams. The snow did not fall from above, but parallel to the ground, turning the familiar forest into a white, roaring void. Yegor walked on his old hunting skis, almost by touch, checking the feeders for roe deer. It seemed like a pointless activity in such a blizzard, but a habit developed over half a century was stronger than common sense. And then he saw them. 2 small, dark blobs on the trail. They weren't moving. They just sat there in the snow, almost completely covered, and stared at him. Lynxes. They were tiny, only about 4 months old. Yegor froze. Any wild animal, especially a young one, should have disappeared in the blink of an eye at the sight of a human. But these 2 sat motionless. There was no wild fear in their wide, frightened eyes. There was something else. Desperation. Silent anticipation. The old gamekeeper slowly took off his ski and stuck it in the snowdrift. He took a step. The lynx cubs did not move. One, slightly larger, only pressed its ears against its head. The second, on the contrary, raised its head slightly. Yegor Kuzmich understood that something had happened. Something terrible. Their mother. Where was their mother? She would never have left them alone in this weather. He slowly walked against the wind, back to where the kittens had come from, leaving a deep furrow in the snow behind him. The lynx cubs hesitated for a second, then silently followed him. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We're curious to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. It motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. The tracks didn't lead far. Just 100 meters away, under an old pine tree that had been uprooted, Yegor saw her. A large, beautiful lynx lay on its side. The snow around it was soaked with dark, almost black spots of blood. Its side heaved heavily. Its breathing was hoarse and intermittent. Its hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. The torn wound, from which blood was still oozing, was terrifying. But even more terrifying were the smooth, deep marks left by steel teeth embedded in the flesh. A trap. A poacher's trap, unregistered. Whoever set it knew that an animal caught in such a trap would not get far. It would slowly bleed to death until it finally weakened. Yegor dropped to his knees. The lynx opened its eyes. There was no longer any ferocity in its yellow gaze, only dull, all-consuming pain. The cubs crawled over to her and poked their muzzles into her cold fur. The scene was so poignant that the old gamekeeper, who had long since forgotten how to cry, felt a twinge in his chest. He could have just walked away. That was the law of the taiga. The weak perish. But he looked at the 2 little balls of fur that had silently led him here. They had broken the law. They had asked for help. And now it was his turn to decide whether to remain faithful to the harsh rules of the forest or follow another, almost forgotten law. The law of mercy. He looked at the roaring sky, then back at the lynx. The decision came on its own. He would not let them die. Not in his forest. Not today. Getting an adult lynx out from under a snow-covered pine tree was an almost impossible task. The animal weighed at least 20 kilograms. and its exhausted body still harbored the strength of a wild predator, capable of tearing a man's arm off with a single blow. But Yegor acted without fuss, with the methodical precision taught him by the taiga. He cut down several young, flexible birch trees. He quickly tied them together with a piece of rope he always carried with him. The result was a kind of stretcher. The hardest part was dragging the lynx onto it. She growled, weakly, more from pain than anger. Yegor talked to her, in a quiet, calm voice, the same voice he had once used to comfort his sick wife. Quiet, quiet, beautiful. Hang in there. I'll help you. I'll help you. He didn't know if she could hear him, but the words made him feel better. Finally, he succeeded. The lynxes, which had been huddling against the trunk all this time, watched him intently. When he pulled the stretcher, they followed without hesitation. The journey to the cordon turned into torture. The wind blew icy flakes into his face. Every step was a struggle. His 72-year-old body screamed with exertion. But Yegor stubbornly pressed on, feeling the breath of 2 little lives behind him that now depended only on him. He was not just dragging a wounded animal. He was carrying a responsibility that had suddenly filled his lonely life with a heavy but important meaning. His cordon was an old but sturdy log cabin with a shed attached to it. Normally a peaceful haven of quiet and tranquility, it now seemed like the last bastion of civilization amid the roaring chaos. It was impossible to bring the predator into the house. Yegor cleared a corner in the cold but wind-protected shed. He scattered some old hay. Carefully, trying not to cause any unnecessary pain, he transferred the lynx from the sled. It was no longer resisting, only moaning softly. He let the cubs follow. They immediately huddled against their mother. First, he had to tend to the wound. He melted a bucket of snow on the stove in the hut. He brought warm water and old but clean rags that he had kept since the time of the late Maria. Washing the terrible wound, he realized that things were bad. Very bad. The edges were ragged, and dirt and small splinters were visible inside. Infection was setting in. He did everything he could. He treated the wound with a strong solution of potassium permanganate and applied a tight bandage from whatever he could find. Then he brought the kittens a saucer of warm goat's milk, which he had been saving for himself. At first they lapped it up cautiously, then greedily. Yegor sat on an old box and watched them. Outside, the blizzard howled. Here, in the semi-darkness of the barn, 3 lives were fighting for survival, and he was the only one standing between them. The feeling of loneliness that had been his constant companion in recent years receded. In its place came a heavy, all-consuming anxiety. A few dozen kilometers from the cordon, in his shabby, smoke-filled hut, sat Stepan Gordeev. He sat and seethed. He was angry at the blizzard that prevented him from checking his traps. He was angry at his lame leg, which ached in the weather. He was angry at the whole world, which had been unfair to him. Once he had been a respected lumberjack. But then came an injury, redundancy, and now here he was, a cripple whom no one needed. Poaching became his only source of income. He set snares for hares and traps for foxes. But this time, he was going for the big catch. He tracked down a lynx with kittens, a large female. Her fur was worth a fortune, and live lynxes could be sold for even more. He set a trap on her trail, powerful, jagged, illegal. He knew that it would not only hold her, but break her bones. And now he sat and waited for the damn blizzard to subside. In his fevered imagination, he was already counting wads of cash. He imagined how he would leave this hellhole and buy himself a proper prosthetic leg. That money was rightfully his. He had earned it. And he wouldn't let anyone take it away from him. No one, He poured cheap vodka into a cloudy glass, drank it in one gulp, and stared out the window, where nothing could be seen but white, swirling fog. His prey was out there somewhere, waiting for him. A day passed. The blizzard continued. Reese was getting worse. She was tossing and turning in the heat, her breathing shallow. The bandage was soaked with blood and something else. Yegor realized that she had started to get an infection. He didn't have enough knowledge or resources. He needed a vet, a real doctor with antibiotics and instruments. But how could he call one? There had never been a telephone at the checkpoint. His only window to the world was an old Soviet radio station called Angara 1. He used it once every 6 months to let people know he was alive. The batteries were old, but he had saved them. With his heart pounding, he turned on the radio. He turned the tuning knob for a long time, trying to catch the radio station's signal through the crackling and hissing. "Pine, Pine, this is Cedar. Come in, Pine." Silence. Only the howling of the blizzard could be heard on the air. He tried again and again. His hands were shaking. He felt like the captain of a sinking ship. Finally, a faint female voice broke through the crackling. "Doctor, I can hear you very poorly. Repeat." It was Anna Sergeyevna Volkova, a young veterinarian who had come to their remote area a year ago as part of a government assignment. "Anna, this is Kuzmich, from the cordon," he shouted into the radio. "A lynx, wounded, trap, dying. Need medicine, antibiotics." The connection was interrupted. He had to shout each word several times. He tried to explain the seriousness of the situation, but the radio was again jammed with interference. Anna Volkova sat in her small but immaculately clean office in the district veterinary clinic. She couldn't even see the neighboring house from the window. She stared at the radio, which emitted only white noise. The call was cut off. She could only make out fragments of phrases. Kuzmich, cordon, lynx, dying. But that was enough. Yegor Kuzmich Sokolov, an old hermit gamekeeper, a legend in their region. If he, with all his experience, was asking for help, then things were really bad. Kuzmich's cordon. That was almost 70 kilometers along a forest road. Now, in a blizzard like this, that road was impassable. Her old UAZ Loaf was a reliable vehicle, but even it might not make it. Getting stuck in the taiga in a blizzard like this was certain death. Any sane person in her place would have waited for the storm to pass. But she thought of the word dying. A wild animal, just a lynx. Was it worth the risk? Anna looked at her hands, the hands of a veterinarian. She had sworn to help animals, all animals, without exception. Was there a footnote in small print in that oath that said, "Except when it's dangerous to your life"? She stood up resolutely. She gathered everything she might need in her medical bag. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, painkillers, a surgical kit, and suture material. She put on her warmest sheepskin coat and boots. She went outside. The wind immediately knocked her off her feet. She looked toward the taiga, toward the white, roaring nothingness. Somewhere out there, 70 kilometers from this hell, a living creature was dying. And there was an old man trying to save it. She couldn't let them down. She started her UAZ. The engine roared loudly in protest. Anna turned on the headlights, which barely pierced the blanket of snow, and slowly pulled away, driving onto a road that, in essence, no longer existed. The road was not a road, but a direction. A white, endless direction that could only be guessed at by the tops of the rare landmarks that Yegor Kuzmich had dug in every autumn. Anna's UAZ roared like a wounded animal, fighting its way through the snowdrifts. The windshield wipers froze instantly, turning the windshield into a matte ice wall. Anna had to stop every few minutes, get out into the roaring blizzard, and knock the ice off the tires. The cold penetrated even her thick sheepskin coat, burning her face. She drove almost blind, trusting not her eyes, but some inner compass and a faint hope that the car would hold out. Every kilometer was a victory. Every turn, guessed in the white mist, seemed like a miracle. She didn't think about fear. She thought about the hoarse voice on the radio, about the old man who was there alone, and about the animal that was waiting for her as its last resort. Her urban idealism was now being tested by the real, wild elements, and she had no intention of giving up. She clung to the cold steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white and stubbornly pressed down on the gas pedal, forcing the car to crawl forward. Yegor Kuzmich lost track of time. He stoked the stove, poured LYNX into a bowl of lukewarm water that she could no longer drink, and talked. He told her about his Maria, how she loved the forest but was afraid of it, how she knew how to bake the most delicious bread in the world, how they dreamed of children, but God did not grant them any. He spoke quietly, without emotion, just to fill the silence, which had become more frightening than the howling of the blizzard. The LYNX was burning. Her body was shaking with a slight tremor. An unpleasant, sweetish smell of pus crept out from under the bandage. Yegor knew it was the worst sign. He changed the bandage again and again, but it was like trying to scoop water out of a sieve. Life was leaving the beautiful, strong body. It was leaving before his very eyes. And he, who had lived his whole life in the forest and felt like he was part of it, was now completely powerless. He looked at the lynxes. They were no longer trying to huddle close to their mother. They had huddled in the farthest corner in a pile of hay and stared out from there with two pairs of frightened eyes. They sensed it. They understood everything. The hope that had flared up in him when he heard Anna's voice on the radio slowly faded, replaced by a dull, cold despair. By the morning of the second day, the wind began to die down. The snow stopped falling in sheets, settling on the ground in large, lazy flakes. For Stepan Gordeev, this was a signal. He pulled on his felt boots and an old quilted jacket, worn through in several places. He checked the cartridges in his old double-barreled shotgun. He tucked a razor-sharp knife into his belt. He didn't eat breakfast. Hunger only intensified his anger. Stepping out of the hut, he took a deep breath of the frosty air. It was time. Time to take what was his. Despite his limp, he easily stood up on his wide hunting skis and moved toward the place where he had set the trap. It was not difficult to find. The snow could not hide the traces of the struggle. A trampled area, scraps of red fur, and, most importantly, blood. Brown, frozen spots on the white blanket. Stepan's heart beat faster. She was gone. Wounded, but gone. He looked around like a predator, reading the book of the forest. There was her trail. Deep, broken. She was dragging her hind leg. She couldn't have gone far. But what was that? Next to the lynx's tracks were others. Human ones. And then he saw something that made him grit his teeth. A wide, smooth furrow from a sled. Someone had found his prey. Someone had dragged her away. Stepan's face contorted. This wasn't just theft. It was a personal insult. He looked in the direction the tracks led, to the northeast, to where the old gamekeeper's hut stood. Sokolov. Kuzmich, he hissed into the frosty air. Well, old man, you asked for it. Anna's UAZ drove 50 kilometers. It was almost unbelievable. But the taiga does not forgive overconfidence. On the next descent, under a fresh, loose layer of snow, there was a hidden ice patch. The car skidded. Anna instinctively turned the steering wheel, but it was too late. The UAZ slid off the barely visible track, hit a huge snowdrift with its nose, and stalled. The silence that followed the roar of the engine was deafening. Anna turned the key in the ignition several times. The starter clicked once and fell silent. That was it. They were stuck. She got out of the car. The UAZ was buried in snow up to its belly. She couldn't dig it out with the single shovel she had. She was alone, in the middle of a silent, snow-covered forest. There was no communication. It was 20 kilometers to Kuzmic's cordon, 50 kilometers back to the village. Walking in either direction was suicide. Panic rose in her throat like a cold, sticky wave. She, a city girl who thought she was a lifesaver, now needed saving herself. She banged her fist on the cold hood. Out of helplessness, out of anger at herself, out of fear. It was beginning to get dark. And with darkness in the taiga always comes real, primitive cold. Yegor sat in the shed, leaning his back against the wall. He dozed fitfully, afraid of missing that very moment. The lynx was no longer thrashing about. She lay motionless. Only her side rose and fell slightly. Her breathing was so quiet that it was almost inaudible. Yegor held a mirror he had taken from Maria's dressing table to her nose. It was slightly fogged up. She was alive. Still alive. But it was agony. He had lost. All his efforts, all his experience had been useless against the infection. He had failed not only her. He had failed the two little ones who had trusted him. He looked in their direction. They were huddled together, staring at their mother. They didn't take their eyes off her. It was as if they understood that they were saying goodbye. Yegor stood up and walked over to them. He held out his hand. Ugolok, the bolder of the two, did not flinch. He just twitched his ear and looked at the old man. There was no fear in his eyes anymore. There was a kind of childish animal grief. Yegor sighed heavily and looked at the lynx again. He did not pray. He did not know how. He just looked at the sky through the cracks in the barn roof and thought about how every life has its limits. And it seemed that he was seeing the limit of this life right now. Stepan followed the trail confidently, hardly looking at his feet. He knew this forest better than his own hut, every ravine, every clearing. The trail led straight to Sokolov's cordon. There was no doubt about it. The old geezer had decided to claim his prey. Maybe for himself, or maybe to turn it in and get a reward. Stepan smiled. He'd picked the wrong guy. He would go around the cordon from behind, from the ravine. He would sneak in quietly, without making a sound. He didn't want to meet the gamekeeper face to face. Why risk unnecessary conversation? He would just take what was his. The lynx was probably already dead. All the better. All that was left to do was to skin the carcass and collect the kittens. They must be weak and frightened now. They wouldn't be much trouble. In the gathering twilight, he saw a faint light ahead. It was the window of Kuzmich's hut. And nearby, a little to the side, in the cracks of an old shed, a dim light from a lantern or kerosene lamp was also shining through. Stepan's heart pounded with predatory excitement. There they were. All his luck, his entire future fortune was now there, in that old, rotten shed. He took off his skis and leaned them against a tree. He took the rifle from his bosom. He checked the triggers, and slowly, crouching down, stepping silently like a beast, he began to approach the shed. Anna was freezing. She sat in the cab of the UAZ, wrapped up in everything she had, but the cold penetrated to her bones. Her whole body was shaking. She knew that if she stayed there, she would not wake up in the morning. She had to do something. She looked at the ignition lock again. This was her last chance. She gathered all her willpower. She waited a minute, giving the battery at least some chance to come to life. She talked to the car as if it were alive. "Come on, sweetie, come on, baby. Don't let me down." She turned the key. The starter emitted a plaintive, drawn-out groan. And then suddenly the engine coughed. Once, twice. And with a strained roar, it started. Anna screamed with joy. She stepped on the gas, rocking the car back and forth. The wheels squealed as they dug into the snow. But the UAZ, like a stubborn mule, slowly, inch by inch, began to crawl out of its snowy prison. At that very moment, when Stepan was already 10 steps away from the barn door and his finger was on the cold trigger, Yegor Kuzmich, sitting next to the Lynx, saw her side stop rising. He put his hand on her neck. There was no pulse. He froze, staring at the motionless body. Was it really over? Was he too late? Silence fell over the barn. It was thick and heavy, like a tombstone. Yegor Kuzmich didn't move, his hand resting on the lynx's cooling fur. It was over. He had failed. He had lost. A feeling of guilt and helplessness weighed heavily on him. He had failed not only the animal, he had failed those two little ones, who were now completely orphaned. He looked at them. They sat huddled together, staring at him. Their world had collapsed. And in this new, frightening world, he was all they had left. An old, tired man who had failed to perform a miracle. At that moment, the barn door creaked. Stepan Gordev stood in the doorway. His face, illuminated by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, looked like a mask, angry and determined. In his hands, he held a double-barreled shotgun, aimed directly at Yegor. "Well, Kuzmich," he hissed, shifting his gaze from the gamekeeper to the dead lynx. "Decided to profit from someone else's good fortune? That's not good, old man." Yegor slowly got up. Fatigue and bitterness were instantly replaced by cold rage. "So, it's you, Stepan. You're the one who did this," he said, nodding toward the trap he had removed from the lynx's paw and thrown into the corner. "It's mine," Stepan grinned. "Rightfully mine. And you're a thief. Now you're going to give me back everything, the skin and these guys," he said, pointing the gun at the lynxes. At that very moment, when the tension in the barn reached its peak, the sound of a motor revving up could be heard outside. The headlights of a UAZ broke through the darkness, hitting the cracks in the walls of the barn and forcing Stepan and Yegor to close their eyes. The car skidded and roared to a halt right in front of the hut. Stepan was confused for only a second. "Who is it?" he growled. "None of your business," Yegor snapped, realizing that this was his only chance. "Get out of here, Stepan, before you do something stupid." But Stepan was in no state to listen to reason. The arrival of an outsider only spurred him on. He cocked the guns. "First, I'll take what's mine," he hissed and stepped toward the lynxes. And then something happened that no one expected. Ugolok, a small, frightened kitten who seemed to have nothing left but fear, suddenly arched his back. He hissed like a snake and lunged forward, sinking his sharp milk teeth into Stepan's felt boot. It was suicidal. It was desperate. And it gave Yegor that split second he needed. Without hesitation, he lunged at the poacher. The old man and the poacher locked in a fierce, silent struggle. The gun fired. The shot hit the ceiling, showering everyone with dust and splinters. Anna turned off the engine and heard the shot. Her heart sank. Without hesitation, she grabbed her heavy medical bag and rushed to the barn, where she could hear the sounds of a struggle. She threw open the door and froze in the doorway, By the light of a single lamp, two men, one old and one young, were rolling around on the floor, trying to wrestle the gun from each other. Two frightened kittens sat next to the dead lynx. The scene was surreal and terrifying. Anna froze for a moment. But then her professional duty took over. She saw something that the men in the heat of battle had not noticed. The lynx, which everyone thought was dead, twitched its paw. Once, then again. It wasn't agony. It was a reflex reaction to the sound of the shot. She wasn't dead. She was in deep shock on the verge of death, but her heart was still beating. "She's alive," Anna shouted, not recognizing her own voice. Her cry made both men freeze for a second. That was enough. Yegor, summoning his last ounce of strength, wrested the gun from Stepan's weakened hands. He threw it aside. Stepan, realizing that he had lost, that he was about to be overpowered, rushed toward the exit, pushing Anna aside, and disappeared into the darkness of the night. Silence fell again in the barn. But now it was different. It was filled with ragged breathing and desperate hope. "Help me, girl," Yegor croaked, getting up from the floor. "Help me, for the love of God." Anna cast aside all her doubts. She ran to the lynx. There was a pulse, weak, thread-like, but there. His breathing was barely audible. "Severe traumatic shock," she said. "He needs adrenaline and antibiotics urgently. Otherwise, it won't live until morning." She opened her bag. Her hands, which had been trembling from the cold just a moment ago, now moved quickly and precisely. A syringe, an ampule, an injection straight into the muscle. Then another, with a powerful dose of antibiotics. "We need hot water," she ordered Yegor. "And as many clean rags as possible, and light. We need more light." Yegor, without asking any questions, rushed into the hut. He brought another kerosene lamp and an old but working battery-powered flashlight. The barn became brighter. Anna worked feverishly. She removed the old bandage. The wound was terrible. It was inflamed, swollen, and showing clear signs of necrosis. "He needs surgery," she said, more to herself than to Yegor. "Right here, right now. The wound needs to be cleaned and the dead tissue removed. Otherwise, it will become gangrenous." Operating in a barn, on dirty hay, by the light of two lamps, was madness. It was a violation of every conceivable and inconceivable sanitary norm. But there was no choice. It was either madness or death. "Hold the lantern," Anna said to Yegor. "Shine it right here. And don't be afraid." Yegor, who had seen a lot in his life, obediently took the lantern. He watched as the thin fingers of this city girl in a veterinary coat thrown over a sheepskin coat worked their magic. A scalpel, tweezers, clamps. She worked quickly and intently, cutting away everything unnecessary and washing the wound with antiseptic. The smell of blood and pus made his head spin. The lynx lay motionless, its body trembling only occasionally. The cubs, emboldened, came closer and watched what was happening. They seemed to understand that their mother's fate was being decided at that moment. Anna sewed. Stitch by stitch, she pulled the edges of the terrible wound together. Her forehead was covered with sweat. She bit her lip from the strain. This was not just an operation. It was a battle for life against death, which had almost won. And in this battle, she had only one ally, an old gamekeeper with a lantern in his trembling hands. Several hours passed. Anna straightened up. "That's it," she said, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "I did everything I could. Now it's up to her. If she survives the night, she'll live." She looked at Yegor. He looked exhausted, aged 10 years in a single night. But his eyes shone with gratitude. He nodded silently. They carried the lynx to some clean hay and covered it with an old blanket. Anna gave her another injection, a painkiller and a sleeping pill. The animal had to sleep and fight. Seeing that it was over, the cubs timidly approached their mother. They sniffed her and, satisfied that she was breathing, curled up next to her. For the first time in 2 days, the whole family was together. Yegor looked at Anna. "Thank you, daughter," he said simply. "It's my job," she replied, but her voice trembled. She felt incredibly tired, but along with that, she felt something else. Pride. She hadn't given up. She had made it. She had done the impossible. She stepped out of the barn and took a deep breath of the frosty, clean air. The blizzard was over. Dawn was breaking over the taiga. And this dawn was the most beautiful of her life. In the morning, while Anna was sleeping in Yegor's warm hut, he followed Stepan's tracks. The tracks were clear and led straight to his hut. There were skis standing near the hut. That meant he was home. Yegor didn't go in. He just turned around and went back to the cordon. He knew what to do. When he returned, he turned on his old radio again. This time, he didn't call Pine Tree, but Bear, the call sign of the district police officer. The connection was poor, but Yegor managed to convey the main thing. Attack at the cordon. Poaching. Stepan Gordeev. He had no doubt that Stepan would now be found. There was too much evidence against him. The abandoned rifle, the tracks, his own testimony, and Anna's testimony. Justice had to prevail. If not in the taiga, then at least among humans. But right now, he was more concerned about something else. He went into the shed. Anna was already there. She was changing the bandage on the lynx's paw. "The temperature has gone down," she said without turning around. "It's breathing evenly. The crisis has passed." The lynx opened its eyes and looked at them. There was no more pain in its gaze. There was wariness. And something else. Understanding. It looked at the two people who had saved it and its children. The next few days turned into a routine filled with quiet hope. Yegor Kuzmich's cordon became like a forest hospital. Anna, realizing that she couldn't abandon her patient now, decided to stay. Her UAZ still needed minor repairs after its battle with the rough terrain, but more importantly, she felt responsible. Every few hours, she gave the lynx injections, dressed its wounds, and monitored its temperature. Yegor took care of the household chores. He chopped wood, stoked the stove, cooked simple but hearty meals for the two of them, and fed the lynx. The kittens quickly got used to people. They cautiously took pieces of boiled meat from Yegor's hands, and then, emboldened, began to play with each other right on the floor of the hut while their mother slept in the barn. This unexpected life brought two very different people closer together. The old, silent gamekeeper and the young, energetic veterinarian. They hardly spoke about what had happened. They talked about the forest, about animals, about life. Anna was surprised to discover an interesting conversationalist in the stern old man, someone who was wise and sensitive to nature. And Yegor, for the first time in many years of loneliness, felt that his home was filled with life again. He watched Anna fuss over the lynx cubs, and a warm, almost forgotten smile appeared on his wrinkled face. The lynx recovered surprisingly quickly. Her wild body mobilized all its strength and fought for life. After only 3 days, she was able to lift herself up on her front paws. 2 more days passed, and she began to eat on her own. She took the food Yegor brought her with distrust, but hunger got the better of her. She saw that her kittens were fed and safe. She saw that people were not harming her, and her instinctive distrust of humans slowly gave way to a forced neutrality. She allowed Anna to treat her wound, although each time she tensed her whole body and growled quietly, showing that she was still a wild animal, not a domestic cat. Anna understood her without words. She worked carefully, talking to the lynx in a calm, confident voice. A fragile bond developed between the woman and the animal, based on professionalism on the one hand and instinctive understanding on the other. Once, when Anna had finished bandaging the lynx, it suddenly stretched out its head and gently, almost weightlessly, nudged her hand with its wet nose. Anna froze. It was not a sign of friendship. It was a sign of recognition, the highest degree of trust that a wild predator was capable of. On the 5th day, the local police officer arrived at the cordon. The police captain, a tired middle-aged man, arrived on a powerful Buran snowmobile. He brought with him a witness from the village. The local police officer questioned Yegor and Anna in detail and recorded their statements. He examined the shed, photographed the traces of the struggle and the trap. Yegor gave him Stepan's rifle. "We caught Gordev," said the captain, warming himself with tea in the hut. He didn't resist for long. When he realized that you two were witnesses and that you had his gun, he broke down. He confessed everything. Stepan Petrovich will go to prison for poaching and for assault. He'll be in for a long time. Yegor nodded silently. He felt neither joy nor satisfaction, only heavy fatigue. This story had worn him out. He looked out the window at the snow-covered taiga. One man had tried to destroy a life for profit. 2 others had saved it, risking their own lives. Such was the world. Both the taiga and human society lived by the same laws of the struggle between good and evil. As he left, the police officer looked at Anna. "Thank you, Anna Sergeyevna. Not everyone would have done that. You're a real hero." Anna just smiled shyly. She didn't consider herself a hero. She was just doing her job. Time passed. Winter was well underway. The wound on the lynx's paw had almost healed, leaving only a rough but strong scar. She was already moving freely around the barn, and sometimes Yegor let her out to walk in a specially fenced enclosure. Each time, she showed her wild nature, but always returned. She understood that she couldn't hunt yet. The kittens had grown into agile, strong young lynxes. They staged real battles in the pen, honing their hunting instincts. Anna left for the village a week after the police officer arrived, but she returned to the border every weekend. To check on her patient, bring him medicine, and just spend time with Yegor. A strong, deep friendship had developed between them, similar to the relationship between a grandfather and granddaughter. They repaired Anna's old UAZ together, went skiing in the forest together, and drank tea together on long winter evenings. Yegor Kuzmich seemed to have grown younger. He was no longer a lonely recluse. He had a purpose again. He had a family again. An unusual, strange family consisting of a city girl and 3 wild lynxes. But it was his family. But the closer spring came, the more Yegor and Anna thought about the future. What to do with the lynxes? It was impossible and wrong to keep them. Wild animals should live in the wild. But could they be released? His mother, although she had recovered, was still weak. Would she be able to hunt properly to feed herself and her almost adult children? And the lynx cubs. They had grown up practically in front of a human, accustomed to him. Had they lost the fear that was essential for survival in the taiga? This question tormented them both. One evening, sitting by the stove, Yegor said, "We'll have to let them go, Anya. Their home is there." He nodded toward the window. beyond which the endless forest began. As soon as the snow melts and the first game appears, we'll have to take them far away from here and release them. Anna was silent. She knew he was right, but the thought of parting with the animals that had become so dear to her was unbearable. She felt especially sorry for Ugolka. The brave little kitten who had been the first to rush to his mother's defense had become attached to her more than any of the others. He let her stroke him and purred loudly, just like a domestic cat. In early April, when the first green grass appeared on the thawed patches of ground and birds began to sing in the forest, Yegor and Anna realized that the time had come. It was a difficult decision. They prepared a special cage for transport. It was not easy to lure the lynx into the cage. She sensed that something was happening and behaved cautiously. But in the end, they succeeded. They put the lynx in another, smaller cage. Yegor got behind the wheel of his old but reliable Gaz 66, a real forest all-terrain vehicle. Anna sat next to him. They drove in silence. Each was lost in their own thoughts. They drove deep into the forest, to the most secluded, untouched corner, where few people ever ventured. It was a place where there was plenty of game, and where it would be easiest for the lynx family to start a new life. They stopped at a large clearing by the river. Yegor opened the cage. The mother lynx, whom they had never named, but simply called Lightning for her beauty and strength, did not come out right away. She stood there for a while, breathing in the scents of her native forest. Then she looked at Yegor, long and intently. Her gaze said it all, gratitude and farewell. Then she turned around, waited for her children to jump out of the other cage, and without looking back, slowly and with dignity, disappeared into the thicket. The cubs paused for a moment. Snowflake, always more cautious, immediately followed her mother. But Cole turned around. He looked straight at Anna. His gaze was puzzled. Why were they leaving him here? He took a step toward her. Anna's heart sank. She wanted to shout, to call him back, to take him with her. But she held back. She knew it would be a betrayal of him. She just stood there watching him hesitate. At that moment, a short, inviting growl came from the thicket. Ugolak shuddered. His wild instinct took over. He took one last look at the people who had saved his family, turned around, and ran after his mother and sister. In an instant, all three disappeared into the greenery of the forest. Yegor and Anna stood in the clearing for a long time, watching them go. They didn't say a word. Words were unnecessary. Their hearts were both bitter and light. They had done the right thing. They had given back to the forest what belonged to it. The return to the deserted cordon was difficult. The silence that had once been Yegor Kuzmich's natural habitat now weighed heavily on him and oppressed him. The hut seemed empty and cold, despite the heated stove. The barn, which had been bustling with life just a short time ago, stood silent and dark. The familiar sounds were gone. The snorting of the lynxes, their scuffling, the alert growling of the mother. Anna also felt this emptiness. She mechanically went to check the bowls from which she had fed the kittens and stopped short. It was all over. The story of their rescue had come to its logical conclusion, leaving behind a poignant feeling of loss. In the evening, they sat at the table in silence. Everyone understood that this day was not only a day of farewell to the lynxes, but also a day of farewell to each other. Anna had to return to the village, to her work, to her life. Yegor was staying here, in his forest, in his solitude. "Maybe you'll stay another day?" he asked, surprising himself. Anna looked up at him. There was such undisguised longing in his eyes that her heart ached. She nodded. They spent the day like ordinary people. They talked about trivial things and repaired the fence, which had been damaged over the winter. Anna told him about her family in the city and how she had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian since childhood. For the first time, Yegor spoke of Maria not as a distant memory, but as a living person. He showed her photos and told funny stories from their youth. And in this simple human interaction, they both found comfort. Anna suddenly realized that this old gamekeeper had become more than just a friend to her. He had become like a father she never had. And Yegor looked at this young, strong, kind girl and realized that he didn't want to let her go. He didn't want to be alone again with the silence and memories. In the evening, when they were sitting by the stove again, Anna said, "Yegor Kuzmich, I have so much work to do at the sanatorium. I don't have enough hands, especially with large animals. I could really use a helper like you, someone experienced, with strong hands." She said it as if she were joking, but she looked serious. Yegor was silent for a long time, staring into the fire. Move to the village? Leave his cordon, his forest, where he had lived all his life? The thought seemed wild to him. He was a tree with roots growing deep into this land. But then he looked at Anna, and he thought of the endless, lonely days that awaited him here. He remembered how happy he was every time she came to visit, how his house came to life, filling with her voice and laughter. Maybe sometimes you have to uproot an old tree to transplant it to a new garden where it can bloom again. "I'll think about it, Anna," he said quietly. And in that, "I'll think about it," there was more hope than in all the words he had spoken in the last few days. The next day, Anna left. They didn't hug when they said goodbye. They just looked into each other's eyes for a long time. "I'll be waiting, Kuzmich," she said, and got into her UAZ. Yegor stood on the porch for a long time, watching the car drive away. He was left alone. But for the first time in many years, this loneliness did not seem eternal to him. A year passed. Much had changed in Anna Volkova's life. Her small veterinary clinic had turned into a real animal rescue center. The fame of the female veterinarian who had saved a family of lynxes in the taiga spread throughout the region. People began to bring her wounded birds, foxes hit by cars, and orphaned squirrels. Impressed by her work, the local authorities allocated funds for new equipment. But the main change in her life was a new employee, Yegor Kuzmich Sokolov. In the fall, he finally made up his mind. He sold his empty house in the village and moved into a small wing of the clinic. He didn't abandon his cordon, going there every weekend to check that everything was in order. But now, the clinic was his home. His wise advice and skilled hands were invaluable to Anna. He could calm anyone, even the most aggressive dog, repair any cage, and build any enclosure. He became the heart and soul of their little center, and he was no longer alone. There was always life around him, always work, always Anna. One day in late November, when the first snow fell, he and Anna went to the cordon, just to get some fresh air and check the feeders. The forest was quiet, white and solemn. They skied along a familiar trail, and Yegor told her where each bird nested and where the bear's den was. Suddenly, he froze. A trail of large, clear footprints stretched across the fresh snow, crossing their path. Yegor crouched down. "Look, Anya," he said. Anna came closer. She saw 3 rows of tracks. One was very large, the track of a large female, and 2 smaller ones, but already almost like those of adult animals. They walked side by side, evenly, confidently. "It's her," whispered Anna. "It's them." "They are," Yegor confirmed. They've returned to their home. They're hunting. He looked up and stared in the direction the tracks had led. There, deep in the silent taiga, the life they had saved continued. A strong, free, and wild life. Yegor looked at Anna. She was smiling, and at that moment, he felt absolute, all-consuming happiness. He realized that the day in the blizzard, when two little lynxes silently asked him for help, was not the end of his story. It was its true beginning. God had not sent him a test, but a gift. The gift of a new life, a new purpose, and a new family. He had made the right choice, and now his forest, his taiga, was responding with gratitude. What may do Golka, a small and frightened lynx cub, rush at an armed poacher? Instinctive protection of his mother, or a conscious act of gratitude to his savior, who was in danger at that moment?